Alright folks, how you doing? So my voice is a little bit groggy this morning. I'm nursing a slight hangover, so you'll have to bear with me. But I'm going to be reacting in this video to Ged Skeptic's latest lunacy. Um, what's the name of this video again? Was Douglas king before the Stuarts? Fake king list and land ownership. Listen folks, there's no such thing as a fake king. That's a self-defeating notion right off the bat, because the kings in that society, in feudal societies, are chosen by Parliament. I was told this, by the way, in Greyfriars Kirk in Edinburgh. One of the tour guides told me this. Parliament has to ratify the king. The nobility have to support him, and the church have to be behind him as well. So when you're the king, you have to get the approval of a lot of people, And if the nobles don't want you to be king, you're not going to be. Look at what happened to King Edward II, for example. You can look that up. One of the James kings as well was murdered. I forget which one. I think it was James II or the third, but I'm going off memory here. But there have been Scottish and English kings who were deposed in the past. I mean, if they were not ruling correctly, then they would have been overthrown. It happens all the time. And there were civil wars in Scotland and England, incidentally, because of bad kings. But no, there is no such thing as a fake king. The nobles have to back him, otherwise he's fucked. Simple as that.
Hello people and welcome back to another video. At last I've managed to get back to my Mac.
There's various stories about what happened to King Edward II, but the one that Mel Gibson seems to roll with is that they shoved a hot poker up his ass. Oh my god, they must have really hated him.
After a long period of DIY.
I'm not surprised, by the way, that Mel Gibson would go for that theory.
And the house being in complete chaos, I've not been able to sort of get to my computer. So now I'm at my computer looking at all the research, all the little windows I had open and all the literature I was looking at before. And
by the way, I encourage everyone to do this, to look into Scottish history or English history or whatever country you happen to be from, French history, German history. It's all pretty interesting. History was one of my favourite subjects at school, in fact. I've actually got a degree in history from the University of Stirling back in 2012, and a lot of it was Scottish history. I enjoyed it. I love history. A lot of people don't, but it's not as bland as you think once you get into it.
it excites me again when I get back on it, when I read it. It gets the juices flowing again. And I'm here, guys.
See, I actually share Jed's enthusiasm for history. I've got more in common with him than he thinks, because Jed really doesn't like me. Check out the comment section on his video. He's talking about how he's got a bigger dick than me. I agree, Jed. You are a bigger dick than me. Not going to argue with that.
To help if you're when it comes to the history anyway, the Scottish history, because I was a victim of all the Braveheart and Outlaw King stuff.
I don't get this mindset. How can you be a victim of a movie, for fuck's sake? It's a fucking movie. Lighten up, dude. No one ever came out and said that Braveheart was a documentary. There's actually YouTube channels that go into all this, like History Buffs, for example, that totally debunk Braveheart. I mean, Braveheart's been proven to be bullshit 100 times over by now. And Outlaw King was somewhat better in terms of historical accuracy, but again, no one ever said it was a documentary. So if you took it seriously, that's on you. That was your choice. No one ever said that these things were authentically real. I mean, Outlaw King compresses the timeline quite a lot. It takes events that happened over the course of years and compresses it down into weeks and months, basically. But and I think Christopher Pine did a better job with the accent than Mel Gibson, but that's neither here nor there, really. But I've made videos about all this, the good and the bad things about Braveheart and Outlaw King, what I thought of them. And he often accuses me of being a Braveheart fanboy, which is not completely inaccurate. It's a good movie, and I like the fact that it brought a lot of light onto Scottish history and, really helped our economy big time. So there's upsides to Braveheart, but, at the end of the day, it's only a fucking movie, man. If you choose to take it seriously, that's on you. That was your decision. No one ever said it was authentic.
And all the Bruce is the true king and all this stuff. And I know it's all gone now. But we've got to realise that the way the world is today and the way Scots are living, the same people are still owning the land. The same people still rule this world. It's a giant ring of feudalism and nepotism.
Is that true? I think we've kind of moved beyond feudalism by now, you know. As for nepotism, well, that happens in every country in the world. It's nothing new. I mean, why would you think that Scotland would be an exception? It's just delusional thinking.
And it's kind of invisible. But when you start digging into history and picking away the lies, you can see that these people weren't for the best interests of the common people.
This is just stating the obvious. This is just, obviously. Again, why would you think that Scotland would be an exception?
These Bruces, Stuarts, Douglases, and this is what we're looking at today.
Let me go into something very briefly here. The Battle of Falkirk in 1298, the leader of the Scottish army was not William Wallace. It was actually Sir John Stewart. And he died in that battle. So there has been at least one Stewart who has fought and died for Scotland. So this whole idea, like the Stuarts were corrupt or whatever, I mean, what happened just previous to the Battle of Falkirk, I'll cover it more in another video, what exactly went down, but William Wallace got into a dispute with Sir John Stewart about who should lead the Scottish army prior to the battle, and that's essentially why the Scots lost, because they weren't united, and John Comyn, spread dissent between the two leaders when they really needed to be working together instead of at each other's throats. I mean, it's the wrong fucking time to have an argument, have a dick measuring contest just prior to which you're going into a battle, but, it is what it is. Actually, the English won nothing at Falkirk anyway, because I've made a video about this. The Scots counter-attacked at Linlithgow like one day after Falkirk and absolutely slaughtered them, kicked them out. But that's not generally known, But that's the point of true Scottish history. You learn things that you didn't know.
Looking at the Douglas.
Check that video out. I love making that one.
Archives, as they call it. I'm kind of trying to speak quiet because it's night time, but so excuse my soft tone. But yep, I'm back at the literature and the way the world is right now, and especially after the anniversary, 20th anniversary, 9/11, and this whole pandemic that's happening. It's easy to sort of get lost and wonder who's behind all this, what's going on. And
well, it's not really a mystery to me. This stuff's pretty easy to work out, actually, if you look at the right sources. If you follow the likes of David Icke or Michael Tazarian, they go into all this. The Unslaved podcast. You could find out if you wanted to, Jed. Incidentally, you can go on archive.org and get a lot of David Icke's materials for free, which I don't recommend doing. I've bought all the David Icke books. I like to have paper copies, But you can work this out fairly easily if you want to. It's not really a mystery to me.
It's easy to follow the money and the bloodlines and the families and the land. It's in your face. They just muddy the water with the media and the alternative media. Get people talking about Illuminatis, the Jays, all kinds of people.
Well, that's your pal, Validation Boy, who, gets into all that. Incidentally, I find it rather comical that Jed is willing to hang out with a guy like Validation Boy, but me, I'm the piece of shit. Should really be the other way around, but, there you go. There's no accounting for taste, I suppose.
But they blame, but the people are staring you right in the face, a lot of them. They're your politicians, your presidents.
You think politicians and presidents have real power? Not really. I don't think so. I mean, look at Joe Biden, for fuck's sake. I mean, look at all the shit that Trump had to go through to get anything done. I'm not saying for or against Trump. No, don't misunderstand me, but I'm saying, like, he was blocked at every turn. Everything he tried to do, he was blocked. So, you just have to look at that. Yeah, but presidents have real power. Not really. I don't think so.
Kings, your queens that are still kicking about today. Everyone thinks this queen that we've got in Britain is just some harmless old lady. And she's the head of state, she's the head of army.
Check out what David Icke says about her then. Some pretty outrageous things, pretty outlandish. But I will say one thing. The royals are probably... there's a reason why they're not shutting Meghan Markle up. Harry's wife, I should really say. Do you know why? Because she's taken a lot of the stink off them. Because she's actually making the royal family look good, which is quite an achievement. But she's taken a lot of the stink off of like all the controversy surrounding Prince Andrew, for example. So she's a rather convenient distraction. Just saying.
She's not some harmless old lady, and people need to remember that this is the way they want to be portrayed. Because if they aren't portrayed as that, we'll soon get rid of them. They want to be fragile old granny in the background when they're not really. It's like a wolf in sheep's clothing. But like I said, I'm back in my literature, and I forgot how good these articles were that I found. And this is a Douglas one, and as you can see here, guys, they've got the rulers of Scotland, and right away it's Robert the First. Robert the Bruce. So on the Douglas page we've got Robert the Bruce already, and that's what I've realised, that the Bruces, the Douglases, the Stewarts, even Wallace I think was related to the Bruce.
It was. I made a video about that. I think I made several videos about that, in fact. That it was Robert the Bruce, the Earl of Carrick, who knighted William Wallace in the first place. They were cousins.
To some degree, and it's all
because they were both Strathclyde Britons.
A giant family nepotism, and they weren't Scots. They were family foreigners that came.
Well, it's not really nepotism, Jed, because for a lot of the fighting during the First Scottish War of Independence, the Bruce was on the English side. You seem to forget. Not all the time. He did switch back and forth, but, actually, if I remember rightly, Robert the Bruce actually wounded William Wallace at the Battle of Falkirk, as in he was able to score a hit on his shoulder, pierced his armour. So, some nepotism when they're literally fighting on opposite sides. Robert the Bruce was one of the commanders of the English army at Falkirk, according to Henry the Minstrel anyway. I mean, whether you want to believe him or not, but I personally do. I think he's the closest thing we have to an authentic source. So Jed is just largely talking out of his arse here. He's not really done the research. He's just making a whole bunch of assumptions without really much proof. I mean, yeah, he's got this website in front of him, but you have to look at multiple sources, because there's sources that say, for example, Robert the Bruce was there at Falkirk. There's other sources say that he wasn't. I mean, the general consensus is that he wasn't, if I understand it correctly. But, sometimes you just have to make a choice. Who do you want to believe? But that wasn't the only battle. There was another battle where Robert the Bruce fought against William Wallace. So it happened at least twice. So, no, that's not really nepotism.
Over and pretended to be Scots. And really,
Okay, talk about people who are pretending to be Scots. I don't think you really have a leg to stand on there, Chet. His surname's Norman. He was born in England, and his ancestry is 75% Irish. So I'm a little bit confused about how you qualify as a Scot. Just saying.
Common Scot, the common man, got pushed away.
And he's openly admitted all this on his own channel, by the way. That's how I know these things. I mean, how do you think I know?
They got killed. It's like, and we celebrate these people. We do. And it's again, they were fighting for Scotland. They were fighting for Scotland. They were fighting for their land. They weren't fighting for the Scottish people. Well,
that's how feudalism works. Again, this is nothing remarkable. That's how feudalism operates. It's like the mafia and The Godfather. You have the capo regimes. They all report to the Don. They have their own regimes. Well, what do you think medieval lords were? They held the land in trust for the crown, and they paid taxes, and whenever the king called upon them, they would go and fight. But I will say that the English got the worst of the fighting during the First Scottish War of Independence, especially in 1297. I mean, when Wallace was at the height of his power, he was straight out massacring them. And he invaded England twice. And he got within 30 miles of London. So, there you go. In fact, when Wallace invaded in late 1297, he basically burned the whole fucking country down. All the English lords and knights and earls and barons and all of them were scared shitless. King Edward had to send his 18-year-old wife to negotiate with Wallace. So, but of course that kind of gets airbrushed out of most versions. This is why I like Henry the Minstrel. And you could argue it's confirmation bias. Yeah, okay, maybe, but you got to make your mind up at some point. We know that Wallace at least did invade the north of England, at the very least. But yeah.
And today, a tiny amount, it's something like 600 people own 50% of Scottish land private. That's ridiculous. 50% of Scottish land is owned by 600 people.
Well, I personally don't have a problem with that because, first of all, most of Scottish land is pretty empty. There's not much there. Second of all, someone has to own the land. So how is this even a big deal? I don't get what the problem is.
That's ridiculous. And into the one of the biggest landowners is a guy called Anders Paulsen, a Danish guy, and he owns.
I should elaborate on that actually. One of the big reasons why this doesn't bother me in the slightest is we have what's called the right to roam law here in Scotland. So aside from private property, we're allowed to pretty much go wherever we want. And these landowners aren't, as far as I'm aware, doing anything about that. It is Scottish law. You can look it up. It's called the right to roam. So this is a non-issue for me.
A clothing line. What's it called? Is it Joe? I can't remember the clothing line, but he owns a clothing line and he owns a lot of land in Scotland. And the second is Buchanan. Lord Buchanan, or he's a sir or something like that. But he's related to the Stuarts through Charles, a illegitimate child of Charles, this landowner. So at the end of the day, we're still ruled by these false lineages. These.
They're not false, because this is how feudalism worked. King David I in the Davidian Revolution invited the Normans in to Scotland because he recognised that basically it was better to have them on your side than against you, which was pretty smart because the Normans had already conquered England, and he just saw which way the wind was blowing and went with it, which is what you do. I mean, the Normans, if you ever check out the military history of the Norman people, like the conquest of Sicily would be one example. They're not a people that you want to piss off or offend. It's better to have them on your side, and when times change, you have to roll with it. And there were Norman knights who fought under Wallace and fought under Robert the Bruce, who was himself half Norman. But the thing is, like, when you look at books like L.A. Waddell's book, The Phoenician Origin of the Britons, Scots and Anglo-Saxons, all these races are just Phoenicians anyway. They're just offshoots of the general Phoenician race. So again, this is really making a mountain out of a molehill, really. A lot of Norman knights were loyal to the Scottish cause, like Sir John de Graham would be the first and foremost example I can think of. Sir John Ramsay, he may have been Norman, I know he was at least Anglo-Saxon. There were Normans and Saxons who fought on the side of the Kingdom of Scotland during the First Scottish War of Independence. This is just a fact that he doesn't want to acknowledge because it doesn't suit his persecution agenda. How we're oppressed and all this bullshit. Not really true. Scotland was one of the most prosperous countries in the world. I mean, if Scotland had been the backwater Neolithic country that you see in Braveheart, King Edward wouldn't have looked twice in our direction. Why do you think he invaded in the first place? Because the Scottish economy was extremely prosperous and it was a very wealthy country. Scotland's first trade partner in the world was Portugal. We had colonies and trading outposts in the Balkans and the Mediterranean and the north of Europe, France, Norway, everywhere. We were very prosperous. So this is just a persecution narrative which doesn't stand up to any sort of scrutiny at all. Plus Robert the Bruce himself, what his family came up with, David the Earl of Huntingdon, who passed the earlship down to the Bruces when he became king. So they inherited it. So there's nothing false about that. It's perfectly legitimate. And plus, Robert the Bruce was related to King David on his mother's side. So he had royal blood. His claim was absolutely legitimate to the throne. There's nothing false in any of this. His narrative doesn't stand up to scrutiny at all.
Fake, imposter, kings and queens and rulers.
Well, they're not imposters if they're allowed to come in and if they're given lands by the king. Again, this is how feudalism works. It's a symbiotic relationship. They get the land, they pay the taxes, they fight when the king calls on them. And in exchange, they get to rule the land. It's how feudalism operates. And it was the same in England and Europe and everywhere. This is bullshit. This does not stand up to any scrutiny whatsoever.
That supposedly saved us from the English. And this goes for the English too. If you're English or Welsh or Irish, this goes for you too.
Well, this whole thing about this is oversimplified. The first Scottish War of Independence lasted for 32 years. At least 32 years. It depends on when you want to date it back from. Some say it started in 1286, some say it dated in 1296. If you want to believe it started in 1286, it's 42 years. Personally, I go with 1296, but we fought for decades to win our freedom against the English. That wasn't the only war either. There was the Second Scottish War of Independence, there was a War of the Rough Wooing, there was a War of the Covenant. We won them all. We have never lost a war against England. I think we're one of maybe the only other country that can say they've defeated England would be Afghanistan, funnily enough. They've just won their war against against the United States. But there's very few countries in the world that can say they've actually defeated England in a war. France would be another one, but there's not that many. England's got a pretty good track record when it comes to military victories and conquests and things like that. But it took us a long ass time to beat the English. It took a long time. It wasn't won at the Battle of Bannockburn either. The war lasted for 14 more years until 1328. When you see the end of Braveheart, when it's like they won their freedom and all this shit, it's bullshit. Robert the Bruce had to fight on for over a decade longer to finally win the war. I mean, God, the English don't take a fucking hint, man.
Happened to use as well. I'm just focusing on the Scottish part because we have a lot of it rammed in our throat.
Incidentally, another thing about the Bruces, they were actually related to Irish royalty. That's why Edward Bruce put forward the claim for the High Kingship of Ireland. You should look into that. The Bruces weren't just Norman either; they had Irish blood. But we'll skip over that because doesn't suit the agenda apparently.
To keep us happy, all this Braveheart stuff. When really, they still own most of the land out there. How free are we?
Pretty damn free. Like I said, you got the right to roam law. No one's stopping you from going anywhere. Did anyone stop you when you went up to Fortingall, for example? Were there roadblocks? Were people pulling you over every 50 yards asking you questions? Shut the fuck up, man. How free are we? That's another thing as well. Freedom is a state of mind. You're free if you want to be free, but you have to be free in the head and the heart. That's what freedom really is. I mean, Wallace didn't shout freedom at his execution. I think at that point he had his tongue ripped out, so I don't think he was saying a whole lot. But, it is what it is.
How free are we? Got the cheek taken, wave these flags, and Scotland this, Scotland the brave. And
by the way, he doesn't have a clue what the flags actually stand for. The lion rampant symbolises the solar cult, the cult of Aton, if you trace it back far enough. That's what the lion represents. It represents the sun. The saltire probably represents the moon. It's like the lion and the unicorn. You can look into what these things really mean, but that's probably subject for another time.
Freedom and all this rubbish that epitomises Scotland, when, like I said, 600 people own 50% of the land. and something like 11% of the land in Scotland is owned by the people. The other, like...
You're sounding like a socialist here. The people should own the land, or communist. The people. This is how communists talk. So this tells me that Ged is very probably left-leaning. It sounds like it. I could be misreading what he's saying, but... Okay, if the people own the land, what the hell are they going to do with it? You know? See, but he doesn't think that far ahead.
89% or whatever it is owned by private landowners. It's ridiculous. And it goes way back to these bloodlines. And these bloodlines are ruling the world today. These bloodlines are your presidents, your mayors, it goes right down even to...
That's true. I mean, this video's talking about how all the US presidents are related to King Edward, which honestly does not surprise me.
Celebrities, certain actors and singers, and they've all got connections somewhere. If you've got a connection to these bloodlines, they'll put you in a position somewhere. Even if you can't sing, they'll make you a singer. You know what I mean?
Incidentally, while I'm thinking about King Edward, in real life, he had a drooping eye, and he spoke with a lisp. And also he had red hair. So, he's not quite the figure that he was cut out to be by Patrick McGowan or Stephen Delane, you know. And he was known to have a fickle temper as well. I think he was a bit self-conscious about his drooping eye as well, you know.
Anyway, I'm going on a bit of a rant here.
It's alright, there's nothing wrong with going on a rant, mate. I'm known to do that myself from time to time.
But my point is that we've got fanboys and people with their fake... it's like patriot, they're fake patriots.
He's talking about me here, isn't he? What are you talking about? Fake patriots? You're not even a Scot. You were born in England with a Norman surname and your ancestry is predominantly Irish. So what the fuck are you talking about? You want to talk about a fake patriot? Aren't you talking about yourself? By the way, there's nothing wrong with being Irish, incidentally. I love Ireland. I was there about 5 years ago. I spent about a week there. I'd go back in a heartbeat. I love Dublin. Dublin's a great laugh, by the way. If you've never been to Ireland, definitely go to Dublin. I've been to Newgrange. I've been to the cliffs of... what were they again? I've been to the Burren. I've been to Doolin. Moher, I think it was. The cliffs of Moher. I've been to Belfast. I've been to the Giant's Causeway. I've actually got ancestors from Donegal as well, incidentally. They must have been Scots-Irish though, because I didn't have any Irish DNA when I took my test with Ancestry.com. It turned out to be 98% Scottish and 2% Welsh. But no, there's sort all wrong with being Irish, man.
Yeah. What's fueling the
very fun people. Great laugh.
patriotism is a load of bull crap.
Though there are exceptions. There's always exceptions.
And I'll quickly show you guys. I'm going to go in more depth in later videos, but I'll just skim over some of the stuff I was looking at. And this is the Douglas Archives, a collection of historical and genealogical records. So guys, it's douglashistory.co.uk if you want to check it out. I'm using this for fair use, critically. But they have here, under the rulers of Scotland, pictures of the Bruces, these ridiculous pictures, and the House of Alpin. So, guys, in mainstream terms and Scottish history terms, the first King of Scots was Kenneth MacAlpin. Apparently, he united the Picts and the Scots together to make Scotland. So before that, there was...
Just a quick side note about the Picts. According to mainstream history, the Picts seem to disappear from history. It's not true. It's because the Picts never called themselves Picts. Their rightful name was Iberi. You know, because they possibly originated in the Iberian continent. That's one theory. That they were actually related to the Basque. As for the Britons, they came from Germany, according to Commons Beaumont, which, by the way, Ged Skeptic himself has covered on his own channel. But yeah, the Picts didn't disappear. It's just that they never called themselves that. That was the Roman name for them. That was their name for themselves. Their proper name was Iberi.
Wasn't a Scotland. There was Pictland, and there was a Dalriada.
Yep, the Dalriada are the bloodline Scots, such as myself.
Kenneth was one of the came from the Dalriada, who was an Irish. They were Irish. The Picts were more British.
Well, that's overly simplifying it somewhat. They were sort of from Ireland, but I think if you go further back, they were originally from the north, and then during the Great Catastrophe that Beaumont talks about, they went down into the Mediterranean and Egypt and all that sort of thing, and then they came back to the north. But when you look at Dalriada bloodlines, by the way, Ged himself is partially Dalriadan as well, through Clan Donacade. Both of us are descended of Clan Donacade. You notice that we have dark hair and brown eyes. Well, these are not northern features, just saying. That's what you would find around the Mediterranean basin. So, some things are pretty self-evident. And then you watch movies like Highlander where Sean Connery, again, dark hair and brown eyes, talks about how he's Egyptian. Watch these movies with an eagle eye. They can slip things past the goalie sometimes, but if you're paying attention, you'll learn a lot.
But that's been kind of acknowledged by historians, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest this. And this started the year 843. But look here, guys. Before the first king of Scotland, Kenneth, who do we have here? Douglas. In the line of Scottish kings. Let me have a click on that. In fact, wait there. We'll go back there.
Well, that would kind of explain why they were such a fucking headache to deal with. If you watch Game of Thrones, the Red Wedding was based on a real historical event called the Black Dinner. You can look it up. The Douglases for a long time were trying to get on the Scottish throne. If they were previously on the Scottish throne, that might explain a thing or two about why they thought they were entitled to it. There were civil wars in Scotland with the Douglases. They were a fucking headache for a long time.
I think there's a little paragraph beside it. So the 67th king, Buchanan, and I think Buchanan was one of the... I'll have a look here actually. The Duke of Buccleuch.
Well, that reminds me actually, if you go to Edinburgh, the statue outside of St Giles Cathedral was one of the Earls of Buccleuch, I believe. But the Duke or the Earl, I can't remember, I'm going off memory, but that just reminded me of that.
Danish clothing billionaires Anders Holch Paulsen and wife Anne and the Duke of Buccleuch each own more than 200,000 hectares, spread across multiple properties. Anyway. Right, so the 67th king, Buchanan, or Buchanan's the author that claimed this.
Incidentally, Mel Gibson himself is descended of Clan Buchanan. Just thought I'd mention that.
By the way, this was the author, Buchanan. Sorry. So Buchanan claimed this in Rerum Scotorum Historia. I think this was written in 1500s or something. But Solvath...
It was, yep. I know he's referring to George Buchanan. He actually has 3 memorials in Greyfriars Kirkyard in Edinburgh. There's one inside the church, one of the stained glass windows, and there's 2 other memorials to George Buchanan. He was quite an important figure in the reign of Mary Queen of Scots and later King James VI. He's worth looking into, his biography, quite interesting.
This doesn't sound Celtic or Gaelic.
No, it's Latin.
Or British to me, Salvathius.
Well, I wouldn't really read into that too much because Latin was the language of the church, and the elite. So to expect that to be Gaelic seems a little bit nonsensical. Remember, there's a difference between Highland Scotland and Lowland Scotland. There's a big difference, culturally speaking, even to this day. So, wasn't a whole lot of Lowlanders walking around speaking Gaelic. Again, this just shows his ignorance, quite frankly. No one in Edinburgh ever spoke English. English? Gaelic even. Until fairly recently. Gaelic was not the... It was not the national language, let's just put it that way, of Scotland. It never has been. So, again, do your research before you talk about these things, dude.
In LX's 6...
Lowlanders, they never spoke Gaelic. Never.
60 and 1V is 4. So the 64th king himself, the son of Eugenius the 8th, was succeeded by Achaeus, the 65th king. Achaeus was the son of Etphinus and was succeeded by Congalus the 3rd. The 66th king, Congalus, his cousin German, reigned 5 years and was succeeded by Dungalus, or Douglas, the 67th king. So this is what Buchanan claims. And this is what I've been reading with Caledonia, and I'm going to bring up another brilliant essay by Innes, which kind of debunks these guys, Buchanan and Fordin and these other people that kind of backed up the Stuarts with false history. And the false history is still being... It's still being used today to...
Is it false though? I mean, do we know that definitively? Or is it just his opinion? Because it's his agenda, of course, because he doesn't like the Stuarts. Of course, no one ever told him, I suppose, that the Stuarts, fought and died at Falkirk, but anyway. I mean, like I said, all these bloodlines, Britons, Scots, Saxons, if you trace them back far enough, they all intersect. They're all Phoenician at the end of the day. So why get twisted up in knots about it?
To prop up these royals.
Nationalities are different from ethnic groups. You have to be able to separate that in your mind. The bloodline Scots were the Dalriada, but the Kingdom of Scotland was comprised of many different groups. Britons, Saxons, Norman, Norse, Gaels, Dalriada. I'm sure there's one I'm forgetting. But there's like 6 or 7 different ethnic groups. It's the same in England, incidentally, and even in Wales. North Wales are different from Southern Welsh. That's the same in any country. North Germans are different from Southern Germans. This is not something to really get twisted up in knots over.
In Holyrood Palace, they have the portraits of these fake kings hanging up in Holyrood Palace, which is the official residence of the royal family in Edinburgh.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously. I think if you're painting a portrait of someone who was alive 500 years ago, you're going to have to do a bit of guesswork,
Scotland. So, these people know it's a lie. They must know it's a lie. They're fake pictures. Anyway.
Of course they do.
Have a look at Douglas. Even the portrait here. This is fake, guys. Dungalus. Sive Dungalus.
Just an observation, Dungalus sounds a bit like Donegal, doesn't it? Phonetically. I'm not really basing that on anything, incidentally, I'm just saying.
So this was apparently a Scottish king. Dungalus. It was a Douglas. It's ridiculous, guys, but anyway.
Not really. I mean, like I said, if you're painting someone from 1,000 years ago, you're going to have to guess.
Just like the Stuarts and the Bruce.
Do you think they had a painting line around from the 9th century? Come on, dude.
These the Douglases need to wriggle their way into the royal line and...
This is paranoia. No one wriggled into anything. The Bruce inherited his lands from his parents. He inherited the earldom of Huntingdon from his father's line. The earldom of Huntingdon was inherited from King David. When he became king, he passed it down to them. The earldom of Carrick was on Robert the Bruce's mother's side. He inherited the lands. He didn't wriggle his way into anything. He inherited the whole thing. Well, talking about the Bruce anyway.
Claims some land in Scotland, some power. Anyway, I'll read this part. Douglas, King of Scotland, 833 to 838, the 67th King. This is by Buchanan, Rerum Scotarum Historia. Dungalus, the 67th king, Dungalus, the son of Silvathius, was next king to Congallas III, the 66th king. The soldiers, not able to endure the severity of his government, gathered themselves together to Alpanus,
Okay, so he was a tyrant, clearly. That's how it sounds.
the son of Achaeus, and because they could not persuade him by fair means to undertake the kingdom, they compelled him by force and menaces to be seemingly on their side. He, having gathered together an army, and pretended to do as he would have him, disappointed them and fled to Dongalis. His coming was acceptable to the king, but a great dismay to the rebels, and therefore they accuse him to the king, as if Alpanus himself had persuaded them to rebel. The king, well perceiving their calumny, suddenly
Calumny. That's how you pronounce it. Calumny.
prepared his army, and so prevented the rumour of his coming. Those of them which he took he put to death. In the meantime Hungus died, and his eldest son Thorstologus was slain by the fraud of his brother Eganus.
Incidentally, if you look into like Irish myths and legends, you see shit like this happening all the time. It's not unusual. None of this is even unusual.
Neither did the murderer long survive his brother, so that the male stock of Hungus being extinct, his sister's son Alpanus, as next heir, both by an ancient law and in right of blood, claimed the kingdom. The Picts disdained him as a foreigner, whereupon Dongalis sent messengers to them to expostulate the matter, but they refused to give them the audience, but commanded them to depart in 4 days. Dongalis intended to make war upon them with all his might, but in the preparation thereof, as he was passing over the Spey, whose current was very violent, the vessel in which he was sunk, he was drowned, after he had reigned 6 years, some say 7. It is likely that he was buried in Colm Kill. So, that's the story of Douglas, King of Scotland.
Speaking of kings of Scotland, William Wallace was offered the crown. He only accepted it for 1 day on Allerton Moor, but both the Scottish nobility and King Edward wanted him to be king, for different reasons, of course, but, you know. And it's funny that, because Wallace was a second-born, which in that society meant he didn't really have much of a future. He wasn't even entitled to elderslie, for goodness sake. You know, typically second-borns would go into some sort of a trade, you know, become merchants, possibly join the priesthood and all that, but they weren't expected to inherit anything. But among the kings of Scotland was William Wallace. He was king for 1 day.
So the portrait, the monarch is depicted within a painted oval, head and shoulders facing the viewer, wearing armour and a maroon cap with a white feather.
Incidentally, what does it say for Wallace's character that he turned down the kingship? You know, just saying.
The portrait is one of 93 bust lengths commissioned to decorate the Great Gallery at Holyrood House, Edinburgh. It is painted by Jacob de Witt II, a Dutch artist working in Scotland from 1673. Together with 18 full-length, these portraits illustrate the genealogy of the Royal House of Scotland from Fergus I, who ascended the throne 330 BC to James the VII, abdicated in 1689. De Witt's iconographic scheme was based on well-known chronicles of Scottish history by the Renaissance humanist Hector Boece. This is another guy who we debunk in these other pieces of literature. Scotorum Historiae and George Buchanan, Rerum Scotorum. The inscriptions on the paintings correspond with Buchanan's list of Scottish kings. From the left to the right, these are the number of the names of the kings followed.
The thing is, though, is it even right to call them fake? I mean, they're just an approximation, really. And the point is just to keep the record straight, I would imagine. But obviously, you know, the paintings are going to be somewhat made up. Obviously, you know. But to call them fake, I'm not really sure that's correct.
By the date of Ascension. The dates, however, are considerably muddled by a later restorer or perhaps even the artist himself. Both real and legendary, their purpose was to proclaim the authority of the Stuarts as divinely appointed rulers of Scotland. And you've got to remember here, they said the first king was Fergus I, who ascended from the throne in 330 BC. BC. When we know that this Kenneth came in well after that, probably around 500, 600, 800, whatever it was. It was nowhere near 330 BC. The Scottish kings ruled. But this is the Stuarts making stuff up. Along with the Bruces and Douglases and even the Wallaces. I think the Wallaces might even come in it as well.
They sort of do. The Wallaces married him with the Craigie line, the Wallace-Craigie line. But as far as I can tell, they were never really a big deal. Beyond William Wallace, the Wallaces just kind of seem to disappear, really. So they were a bit of a one-hit wonder. As for the Stuarts, well, their bloodline didn't last. You know, they got taken over by another royal house, so there you go.
Both real and legendary, their purpose was to proclaim the authority of the Stuarts divinely appointed rulers of Scotland. Commissioned and paid for by the Scottish Privy Council, the series was intended to convey the power and greatness of the country's governing body as much as that of their king. With no authentic likeness on which to base his portraits of medieval kings, De Wet made extensive use of an earlier set by the Scottish artist George Jameson.
So there you go, they're not really fake, they're based on a previous version, you know, they just had to redo it, sort of thing.
Which 26 survive in private collections. From this limited basis, the resulting series appears rather repetitious, meaning they all look the same.
Yeah.
Because they're just made up, and made up portraits that line the Hollywood.
Jed, you listen to your own words. Just said it was based on previous models. So it's not made up completely.
Palace.
I mean, it would have been embellished somewhat, yeah, but it wasn't totally made up, you know.
To bolster this fake lineage, to convince the people of Scotland that they are divine. And you got to remember, divine right means you're not just a snob that won some battles and you think you should rule the land.
Well, you can ask King Charles I how far his divine right got him when they chopped his head off. You know, deep down, no matter what they said, the kings knew that they depended on the aristocracy, the nobility, the parliament, the church. You know, they answer to a lot of people, and if they weren't happy with them, you can ask King Edward II what happened to him.
You're telling the people you're chosen from God, divine right.
Well, it all has to do with their bloodline. Most of them were red-haired people as well. They had red hair. Like King David I was reported to have red hair. Mary Queen of Scots had red hair. Henry VIII had red hair. Elizabeth I had red hair. You know, it's one of the physical traits of the royal bloodline. A lot of them had red hair. A lot of the Jameses had red hair, in fact. I think all of them did. All the King Jameses.
You have been picked by God to rule the people. So they have to...
There's even the theory that Cleopatra had red hair. And Alexander the Great had the kind of blonde, reddish hair. You know, but when you trace the bloodline back, you can sort of see it.
Make up this bullshit propaganda.
And Genghis Khan had red hair, too, incidentally.
Much more important than their aesthetic merit, therefore, was the symbolic power of painting an extremely long royal lineage stretching more than 2 millennia. Buchanan Rerum Scotarum Historiam, translation from 1751, a valiant and good prince. He was drowned coming over the River Spey to war against the Picts.
Yeah, but all these different groups warred against each other all the time back in the old days, and not only Scotland but Britain. You know, like the Battle of Carham in 1018 was the Scots and the Picts united with the Britons to fight the Saxons. So shit like that happened all the time. You know, the Britons incidentally were led by a king called Owen the Bald. So we have some idea what he might look like. And the Strathclyde Kingdom of Britain was conquered by the Scots. So all these groups went to war with each other all the time. This was pretty standard stuff, you know.
Number 67 in the series, inscribed Dungalis, Sahib Dungalis. So there's a couple of notes here. The Scotti family of Italy claims a lineage from Douglas, King of Scotland. Salvathius,
Well, I wouldn't be surprised.
the 64th king himself, the son of Eugenius the VIII, was succeeded by Accius, the 65th king. Shakespeare describes King Duncan's interment as being at Concal, the
Well, you want to talk about somebody who made a lot of shit up. Look no further.
sacred storehouse of his priesthood. Anyway, guys, Douglas, same again. We can look at the... Where was it? There's actually a family tree. You can see them all, how they all integrate with each other.
Well, in that case, they're not illegitimate then. If they're putting it on public websites, how they all are related in with each other, you know. If they had something to hide, wouldn't they be hiding it? Just saying. Sometimes things are pretty self-evident.
But we can have a look at these legendary kings as well. I'll try and find the family tree before I go. Let's see. Maybe it was back one. It's in here. So here it is, guys. This is where the Douglases weasel their way in. Already up here in the 1300s, the Bruces have now weaseled their way in.
They didn't weasel their way in, they were invited in. There's a difference. You know, when you invite people in to take ownership of lands in your country, it's probably for a reason. You know, like I said, the Davidian Revolution was all about, you know, getting the Normans on board, essentially. Which was a pretty smart thing to do. You don't want to fuck with them, you know. Were the Douglases Norman? Probably. I haven't really looked into it, but it would seem likely.
See Robert II at the top here, with Elizabeth Moore. She dies. She was a Scot. She was connected to Scottish royalty. He snuck in there, married her. She mysteriously died, and he marries Euphemia.
But that doesn't prove anything. Back in those days, people died, you know, of natural causes all the time. You know, she could have caught a cold and died. She could have died of tuberculosis. She could have died of anything. That doesn't really mean anything, you know. I mean, if you got to 42 back in those days, you were doing better than most people. No antibiotics to speak of. Medicine was non-existent, really. Not until a few centuries after this, like the 1600s in Edinburgh, they were starting to improve medicine dramatically, but it took a while after this. 17th century, 18th century. You know, medicine did gradually improve over time, but, you know, in those days, yeah, people were dropping like flies all the time. So this doesn't really prove anything. But, you know, we have an agenda to prop up.
Ross, and they have all these kids. And they're Stuarts, and as you can see, Stuarts.
By the way, the Bruces were not French. There's that general misconception. The Normans were not French. There's a difference between those two.
And there's a Douglas. So William Douglas marries Egidia. Egidia, that was one of their kids. And this is, you can see here the blue squares, guys. This is the Douglases within the Stuarts, the Bruces, and James, Henry Stuart, Mary, all the Stuarts. So there you go, guys.
There was a lot of members of Clan Stuart throughout the centuries in Scotland who contributed a lot. If you go up in Calton Hill, for example, they're one of the sort of monument / temple type things is to one of the Stuarts. I forget his name now off the top of my head, but you know, it's not like they were total parasites and leeches like Ged would have you believe. They did contribute things to Scotland, you know, but you know, don't let that get in the way.
The Douglases is just another imposter, fake royal Flemish descent, if I've not mentioned before.
Was it Dougal Stewart up in Calton Hill? Look it up real quick. I'll let him ramble on for a few minutes while I look this up.
And we've got the legendary kings of Scotland. And this is what Wikipedia says about them. As Scottish Renaissance humanist George Buchanan gave a long list of Scottish kings in his History of Scotland, published in Latin as Rerum Scotorum Historia in 1582, most of whom are now considered by historians to be figures of legend or completely misrepresented. The list went back around...
Yep, I was correct. I found it here. Dougal Stewart. This is the one who's got the monument up in Carlton Hill. A Scottish philosopher and mathematician today regarded as one of the most important figures of the Scottish Enlightenment. He was renowned as a popularizer of the works of Francis Hutcheson and Adam Smith. Yep. So you can see that when you go up Carlton Hill. Anyway, back to this.
1900 years from his time, it began with Fergus I, James VI of Scotland, who was Buchanan's pupil, adopted the story of Fergus I as his ancestor, and the antiquity of the line was emphasised by the House of Stewart. So there you go. Buchanan was his teacher.
He was also the teacher of Mary, Queen of Scots, and her close advisor as well.
So there's Dornadilla, fourth legendary king according to George Buchanan, painted by Jacobs de Wet the Younger, in the commission from Charles II in Holyrood Palace, with these fake pictures hanging up of fake kings in Holyrood Palace.
Again, there is no such thing as a fake king. If the nobility didn't want him, they would have been kicked out. They can prattle on all they want about the divine right of kings, but that didn't stop, Edward II's wife from sticking a hot poker up his ass.
So,
allegedly.
Dynastic importance. The genealogy of Scottish kings going back to Fergus MacFercar, i.e. Fergus I and beyond, was in place by the middle of the 13th century when it was recited at the 1249 inauguration of Alexander III of Scotland. In 1301, Baldred Bissett was involved in a hearing at the papal curia on the Scottish side of the debate on Edward I of England's claims, and at least helped prepare material dealing with the mythological history that was being adduced as relevant on both sides. The question of the antiquity of the Scottish royal lineage, and even the details of the associated origin myth, became particularly significant from 1542 when Mary, Queen of Scots, came to the Scottish throne. Buchanan alluded to Mary's long ancestry in his epithalamium written for her 1559 marriage to Francis II of France, in the period before Mary's betrothal.
Sorry to interrupt him, but I wonder if Ged would consider this source authentic if it was written in Gaelic instead of Latin.
A marriage to Prince Edward, the future Edward VI of England, was much discussed. As part of that debate, the list of legendary kings of Britain became involved, in the form of the Brutus myth of Polydore Virgil.
In fact, Brutus is where we get the name Britain, according to one theory. I mean, it makes as much sense to me as anything else.
Publicists on the English side of the argument, including John Elder, James Henryson, and William Lamb, had cast doubt on the Scottish history. When James VI...
Wait till I get around to the Scottish Chronicon. That'll be quite interesting.
...entered Edinburgh in 1579, the pageantry included a public posting of the genealogy of the Scottish kings, and when his son Charles I visited in 1633, portraits of 107 kings were displayed, some of which, by George Jameson, survive. Another series of 110 imagined portraits of the monarchs from the list was painted for Charles II by Jacob de Wet and hung in Holyrood Palace. The de Wet portrait collection later became a noted site for tourists. For example, it was written about by John...
Yeah, I've seen them when I was there a couple of years ago. Even the guy who was standing next to me pointed out that they're fake. So this idea that these portraits are fooling anyone, no, they're not.
Mackie, a journal through Scotland. So, we're now going to look at the historiography of Buchanan's list, and this means how can...
Listen, I'm getting a bit bored of this now. It just kind of goes on in this vein, and then he talks about the land ownership and how it's unequal and all the rest of it. Blah 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 blah, and he gives me a mention at the end, something to follow me around and all this, I'll link the original video if you want to see more of it. Personally, I think I've seen enough. You get the point. But anyway, thanks for watching.